Welcome to the Factory Farming and the Fragility of Our Food System panel. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Daniel Waltz, and I am a senior staff attorney at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. I'm thrilled to be here with you, learning from some of our country's leading advocates and scholars focused on industrial animal agriculture. And before we begin, I'd like to introduce our speakers. First, Iselin Gambert is a professor of legal writing at the George Washington University Law School, where she teaches courses in legal communication and rhetoric, and a seminar called Gender, Race, Species. Iselin's scholarship spans multiple fields, including language and rhetoric, critical animal studies, critical race theory, food law and policy, and feminist legal theory. She has written extensively on the subject of milk. Jessica Bloom is a shareholder with Greenfire Law, where she primarily practices in the areas of animal, environmental, open government, and land use law. She represents clients in citizen suit enforcement, climate change, and strategic impact litigation. Her practice includes litigating and advising under NEPA, CEQA, the Administrative Procedure Act, the Animal Welfare Act, the Endangered Species Act, and FOIA. And finally, Hannah Connor is a senior attorney in the Environmental Health Program at the Center for Biological Diversity, which is a wildlife conservation organization working to secure a future for all species, great and small, that are hovering on the brink of extinction. For 15 years, she has written, presented, and litigated extensively on the harms caused by industrial animal agriculture to people, animals, and the planet, including by bringing cases against some of the largest meat packers in the world. She is committed to fighting against the secrecy, corruption, pollution, and exploitation that have become hallmarks of this industry, and advocating for a just, sustainable food system. Thank you all for joining us today. We will begin with a presentation from Iselin.
Hi, my name is Iselin Gambert, and I'm a professor of legal writing at the George Washington University Law School. Thank you so much for having me be part of this conference. I'm thrilled to be here. Humanity is about to kill 1 million species in a globe-spanning murder-suicide. What happened just now as I spoke those words? Did you shift uncomfortably in your seat, perhaps, or let out a sigh of dread? Only 11 years left to prevent irreversible damage from climate change, speakers warn during General Assembly high-level meeting. How about now? Is your heartbeat quickening a bit? What if I told you that this headline is already 2 years old? So there's only 9 years left. Feeling a little stressed? Me too. But what are you going to do about it? As a scholar of rhetoric, I see the world through the lens of the different rhetorical narratives that are used in legal, political, and cultural contexts. Often referred to as Aristotle's rhetorical triangle, the rhetorical tools of logos appeals to logic, pathos appeals to emotion, and ethos appeals leveraging the credibility of the persuader underpin every piece of persuasion there is. Doomsday headlines like the ones I just read skillfully blend logos, 1 million species, 11 years left, with pathos, murder-suicide, irreversible damage. More often than not, when it comes to headlines like these, fear is the particular emotion used to get us to sit up and pay attention. Fear, after all, is a powerful emotion, and hearing about the sixth mass extinction unfolding at the hands of human-fueled habitat destruction and climate change is, to put it mildly, very scary stuff. But is fear in the form of a passing headline on our smartphone screens powerful enough to get us to act? If logic carried the day, we'd all go vegan tomorrow. A vegan diet is probably the single biggest way to reduce your impact on planet Earth, said Joseph Poore, a researcher at the University of Oxford. It's far bigger than cutting down on your flights or buying an electric car. There's much more to say about the current science around climate change and the huge role that the animal agriculture industry plays to perpetuate it. Stephen Chu, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, put this into context when he said this: if cattle and dairy cows were a country, they would have more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire EU 28. Just something to think about. My presentation takes this science as a given and works from the premise that unless we do something drastic to stop the march toward irreversible climate disaster that involves our relationship to the things we consider food, the effects will be unthinkable. As the Lancet Commission wrote in 2019, global efforts are urgently needed to collectively transform diets and food production. What is needed is rapid adoption of numerous changes and unprecedented global collaboration and commitment. Nothing less than a great food transformation. This presentation also works from the premise that the animal agriculture industry is dangerous not only because of its contribution to the climate crisis. It also represents a global system of unimaginable suffering and cruelty that, socially acceptable and legally sanctioned, exploits, oppresses, and commodifies billions of individuals every single year. The vast majority of those individuals are non-human animals, but many are human workers, disproportionately immigrants and people of color, who spend day after day plucking, debeaking, milking, and killing, all for low wages, no job security, and at great risk to their own physical and mental well-being. And since March of 2020, animal agriculture workers have faced the threat of COVID-19 exposure at rates higher than the general population. The logical conclusion of this grim reality is that eating animals is an outdated practice that causes more harm than good, according to virtually every conceivable metric. If ever there was a moment where science supported a coordinated global effort to bring forth a drastic change to our consumption habits, this is it. If that sounds like a stretch, we have in the mass lockdowns, social distancing, and new norms around remote work and mask wearing of the last 18 months, proof of the fact that when faced with a serious imminent threat to our well-being, our species is in fact capable of widespread, life-altering changes to our behavior. And yet only 3% of us have stopped eating animals. Part of the problem is that politicians and governments, given their degree of power and influence, should ostensibly be among the leaders in ringing the alarm bells and setting policies and taking actions that might set humanity on a course correction. But that is far from the case. Instead, we see fear prompting politicians and governments to action designed to slow progress and thwart change. Where lawmakers could be allies in developing strategies to promote climate-friendly, plant-based food and discourage consumption of environmentally destructive animal-based food, they're doing just the opposite, making it harder for plant-based food advocates to have a level playing field with the animal agriculture industry, much less get the upper hand in the fight against climate change and species extinction. This presentation explores the role that emotion, namely fear, anger, and rage, play in the battle over the future of food, and offers a strategy to leverage those emotions to help prepare people more effectively to confront the impact that their dietary choices have on the environment, on farm animal welfare and exploitation, and on factory farm workers. With this backdrop, I want to briefly describe two examples of state, national, and international governments introducing and passing legislation and regulations that amount to fear-based linguistic battles with plant-based food. The first example are the so-called real meat laws in the United States. Since 2018, at least 18 states in the US have either introduced or passed legislation restricting use of the word meat. The states have taken a range of approaches, but they share a common theme in their attempt to justify their own existence. They claim that the laws are necessary to prevent plant-based foods from misleading or confusing consumers who may mistake those foods for animal-derived meat and dairy. Real meat laws seek to define the word meat as the substance that comes exclusively from slaughtered animals. The goal is virtually always to prohibit cultured meat, sometimes referred to as cellular meat or clean meat, from using that term on its packaging or its advertising. But some states have gone further and have also sought to prohibit plant-based meat from using the word meat, even when those products use qualifiers like plant-based before the word. The rhetoric around these new laws is almost always that meat from a slaughtered animal is real, discrediting other types of meat, like plant meat and cultured meat, by implying that they are fake. Governments aren't subtle about it either. Mississippi introduced its fake meat bill in January 2019, and Montana enacted its Real Meat Act in April of that year. In October 2019, the Real Marketing Edible Artificials Truthfully Act, or Real Meat Act, was introduced to Congress. But the truth is that there's nothing fake or contrived, radical, or even remarkable about referring to plant-based foods as meat. That word, both in the dictionary and in our vernacular, is not and has never been limited to animal flesh. The Oxford English Dictionary has a multitude of definitions for the word. The definition of plant-based meat appears right below the one for animal-based meat. The earliest reference of the centuries-old linguistic tradition dates back to 1425. There's even a reference to plant-based meat in the King James Bible. What is remarkable is the degree to which lawmakers have been so transparent about the fact that fear is one of, if not the primary motivating force behind the laws and regulations that they advance. Namely, fear that the market for animal-based meat may suffer a significant decline as plant-based products offer consumers meaningful alternatives that are less environmentally destructive and avoid the suffering and exploitation involved in the animal agriculture industry. "I don't make laws for me," said Claire Blood, the Nebraska Democratic state senator, and incidentally a vegetarian, who introduced a bill to exclude plant and cellular-based products from the term meat. "I make laws for Nebraskans. Part of what I have to do is protect our number one industry, and that's cattle in Nebraska." Rhetoric like this is common and widespread throughout the legislative history in the states passing or attempting to pass the real meat laws. The second example is Amendment 171, which the European Union Parliament passed in October 2020 under the guise of protecting consumers from being misled. If allowed to become law, the amendment would have introduced sweeping changes that would ban a wide range of labels on plant-based food products throughout the European Union, including labels such as "not milk" and "milk alternative." Critics slammed the lawmakers who passed the amendment, saying that it treated consumers like they are stupid for assuming that they would be confused or misled by labels such as "does not contain milk," and alleging that the lawmakers care more about protecting the dairy industry than they do about fighting climate change. Oatly, the Swedish oat milk producer, well known for its cheeky and provocative marketing, took aim at Amendment 171 on its website and on its social media, pointing out that the amendment contradicts the EU's own sustainability ambitions. Quote, "This means we can no longer call our products milk-free or talk about any of the health and environmental advantages they offer," said Oatly. "It's a wacko, incomprehensible direction to take in the middle of a climate crisis," end quote. The good news is that in May 2021, the European Parliament voted 124 to 37 to withdraw Amendment 171. This decision came out after over 450,000 people signed a petition circulated by Oatly to kill the amendment. While Amendment 171 may be dead in the water currently, the threat remains of similar fear-based tactics by EU lawmakers to protect the dairy industry at the expense of policies that would proactively fight the threat of climate change. So where does that leave us? We have these legislative and regulatory efforts on both sides of the Atlantic, making it harder for plant-based foods to compete with animal-based foods. But at the same time, we've never been more in need of an unprecedented global collaboration that amounts to a great food transformation. But achieving this sort of transformation is much easier said than done. Joe Leanan, an omnivorous member of the European Parliament, explained the difficulty around advocating for sweeping changes to people's diets as part of climate strategy this way. This is one of the most delicate issues with climate protection, because we all have our habits, and diet is something quite holy for some people not to be meddled with. But of course, we have to meddle with our habits and our diet to achieve the great food transformation that we so desperately need. One strategy could be to lean into logos or appeals to logic to try to persuade people to change their behavior. Oxford University professor Joseph Poore, who researches agriculture and the environment, has proposed mandatory labeling of all food to show the data of each item's environmental impact. Here's an example of Poore's proposed food labels. It's a fascinating idea, but I'm afraid that these images are a bit too clinical and sterile to successfully persuade people to radically change their dietary habits. That's because ultimately, logic is not the primary thing that drives our consumption habits. Emotion is. Journalist Joel Stein was refreshingly honest when he said, "I care about animals and the environment, and even more, virtue signaling about how much I care about animals and the environment. I just don't want to make any effort or sacrifice any pleasure." Journalist Tamar Haspel summed it up really well when she said, quote, "Everyone I spoke with agreed that customers aren't going to buy plant-based foods to save the planet. We're not rational when it comes to food." Because we're not rational when it comes to food, a better strategy would be to combine logos with pathos or emotional appeals to influence people's behavior. Just as meat and dairy advocates have been leveraging fear to influence the laws, regulations, policies, as well as our consumption behaviors, there's a powerful opportunity for plant-based food advocates to leverage fear and also anger to do the same. Feminist scholar Audre Lorde has wrote extensively about the power of emotions and of anger in particular as a catalyst for change. Anger, she said, is loaded with information and energy. Focused with precision, it can become a powerful source of energy serving progress and change. Soraya Chamali, author of Rage Becomes Her, The Power of Women's Anger, expanded on Lorde's idea, explaining that anger has a bad rap, but it's actually one of the most hopeful and forward-thinking of all of our emotions. It begets transformation, manifesting our passion and keeping us invested in the world. It bridges the divide between what is and what ought to be, between a difficult past and an improved possibility. So how can plant food advocates leverage fear and anger to inspire a great food transformation? It turns out that governments already know how to leverage emotions to deter people from consuming certain products. Specifically, graphic warning labels on cigarette packages have been shown to be significantly more effective than simple text-based warning labels because they create a fear and anger-based response that leads to a stronger and longer-lasting intention to quit smoking. So now I'm going to show some graphic images on the next slide. Studies have shown that graphic warning labels like these are statistically significantly more effective at influencing people's behavior around smoking than text-based warnings alone. And it's because of the power of fear and anger that images like these provoke. Graphic warning labels on food would need to combine powerful visual rhetoric, like we see here, with logic-driven facts and data. It's that combination of logos and pathos that is most likely to inspire change. And unlike passing doomsday headlines that we can scroll past on our smartphones, part of the power of graphic warning labels like these would be their ubiquity. We would have to confront them every single time we pick up an item of food in the grocery store, and we would not be able to scroll away. I'd like to see labels like these used to communicate each food item's impact not only on the environment, but also on animal well-being and exploitation, as well as on the wages and conditions of the workers working in the animal agriculture industry. To be clear, I don't think graphic warning labels are a silver bullet. On their own, they won't be enough to radically transform the global food culture. But I do believe they could be part of a multifaceted strategy that leverages powerful emotions like fear and anger to inspire positive change. Because ultimately, I agree with teenage climate activist Greta Thunberg that this is a moment in which we need to panic. We need to feel the fear, not about the loss of our old ways of life or about the decline of powerful and exploitive industries, but about the consequences we will face if we fail to act. We need a new narrative around food, one that rejects the inherent injustices bound up in meat and dairy. And I think we can leverage the rhetoric of fear and anger as one tool among many that can combine to create a fundamental paradigm shift in our relationship to food. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to the Q&A, and I'd love to continue this discussion offline with anyone that would like to email me. My email address is there. Thank you so much.
On behalf of the Lewis and Clark Animal Law Litigation Clinic, my portion of this panel focuses on how advocates can use litigation to affect farm policy in the United States. The clinic advocates for farmed animals in the courtroom by providing litigation support for cutting-edge lawsuits aimed at establishing and expanding legal protections and rights for farmed animals, including challenging the presumption that common inhumane farming practices are shielded from judicial scrutiny and pursuing novel causes of action. I'm going to discuss two cases the clinic is currently litigating on behalf of several animal and environmental protection groups to challenge the USDA's failure to protect pigs destined to be slaughtered for human consumption. The clinic asked me to give this presentation because I currently represent plaintiff groups as a contract attorney for the clinic, but credit for the development of the cases goes to the organizations involved in setting them up for judicial review and former clinic director and current Vermont Law School professor, Delciana Winders, a venerable champion for farmed animals and farmed animal welfare in both policy and litigation. The two cases I will discuss today are similarly styled. The first is Farm Sanctuary versus USDA, which challenges the deregulation of pig slaughter in the United States. The second is Farm Sanctuary versus Vilsack, challenging the USDA's failure to protect downed pigs who are too injured or sick to stand or walk. But first, why pigs? Pigs, along with chickens and dairy cows, are widely regarded as the most cruelly treated animals on the planet. Pigs live for an average of 10 to 15 years naturally, but factory farm pigs are sent to slaughter after just 6 months of life. To get these terrified baby pigs onto transportation trucks bound for the slaughterhouse, workers beat them on their sensitive noses and backs or stick electric prods into their rectums. Once crammed onto transport trucks, pigs struggle to get air and are usually given no food or water for their entire journey, which is often hundreds of miles. They suffer from temperature extremes and are forced to inhale ammonia fumes and diesel exhaust. According to a 2006 industry report, more than 1 million pigs die each year from the horrors of transport alone. Another industry report notes that in some transport loads, as many as 10% of pigs are downers, animals who are so ill or injured that they are unable to stand or walk on their own. These sick and injured pigs will be kicked and dragged off the trucks to their deaths. At the slaughterhouse, more than 1,000 baby pigs die every hour. The pigs are stunned before their throats are slit open. They're left to bleed out, then dipped into scalding water to remove their hair. However, the speed of the slaughter line makes it nearly impossible to ensure every pig is properly stunned before slaughter. This means many pigs are able to see, hear, and smell the pigs around them being killed, and they will be boiled alive when they reach the scalding tanks. Now, this cruelty is made absolutely worse by the USDA's intentional effort to deregulate the slaughterhouse process, which is the subject of the clinic's first case, styled Farm Sanctuary versus USDA. I will quickly but importantly note that the clinic is co-counsel on this important case alongside Animal Equality, the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and the Center for Biological Diversity. Over the past 3 decades, the federal government has intentionally deregulated slaughter. The most recent iterations of this deregulation effort are the USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service, or FSIS, attempts to raise and revoke line speed limits for slaughter lines. For many years, pursuant to its responsibilities under the Federal Meat Inspection Act, the FSIS imposed speed limits on how fast slaughterhouses could operate. To ensure a modicum of oversight of the slaughter process, no more than 1,106 pigs per hour could be killed. But for just as many years, industry has pushed hard to increase or remove that line speed limit altogether, to allow slaughterhouses to increase profits by killing more animals more quickly. In 1997, the FSIS began allowing a limited number of slaughterhouses to operate at faster speeds, pursuant to a pilot program referred to as the Hazardous Analysis and Critical Control Point-based Inspection Models Project, which is a long way for them to just say HIMP. As anticipated, the slaughterhouses participating in HIMP increased overall production by increasing the total number of animals slaughtered. Also, as expected, incidents of inhumane slaughter, worker injuries, and adulterated food increased at hemp plants. Nevertheless, on October 1st, 2019, FSIS finalized a rule to completely revoke maximum line speed limits for pig slaughterhouses. In promulgating this rule, the agency stated that on top of the 5 hemp slaughterhouses, it had determined 35 additional high-volume slaughterhouses would take advantage of the line speed limit revocation. Together, these 40 slaughterhouses are responsible for 93% of pigs slaughtered in the US. To justify the rule, the FSIS underscored that revoking line speed limits would increase industry profits by an estimated $87.5 million annually by facilitating a 12.5% increase in production. This translates to approximately 11.5 million more pigs intensively farmed, transported, and slaughtered annually as a result of the rule change. Given the severe and often dangerous environmental impacts already caused by slaughterhouses, it was entirely foreseeable that increasing slaughterhouse line speeds would worsen environmental impacts to water, air, and soil. Yet the USDA claimed its elimination of line speeds would be categorically excluded from the National Environmental Policy Act because FSIS is exempt as an agency from having to perform a NEPA review for any action it takes. In revoking line speed limits, the USDA acknowledged that federal food safety inspectors would need help keeping up with the faster moving slaughter process. So the rule also goes further by delegating ante-mortem sorting and post-mortem inspection duties to slaughterhouse workers. These workers are not trained in federal meat inspection or humane slaughtering practices to the extent that we could call them humane. So ostensibly, the overworked federal inspectors are supposed to supervise these workers, a truly impossible task not contemplated by Congress when it passed these laws and gave USDA responsibility for administering and enforcing them. And that is the subject of the clinic's lawsuit, as well as 2 other lawsuits I want to tell you about. So the 3 lawsuits challenging the FSIS line speed rule are currently pending. The first is filed by the clinic and Earthrise Law Center at Lewis and Clark Law School on behalf of a coalition of 7 animal and environmental protection organizations. The lawsuit contends that FSIS violated the Federal Meat Inspection Act, the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act when it finalized the rule revoking slaughter line speed limits for pigs without considering the rule's impact on humane handling and the environment. In addition, the clinic's lawsuit alleges that the USDA lacks authority to delegate its congressionally mandated ante-mortem inspection duties to slaughterhouse workers. The clinic's case survived the government's motion to dismiss last summer and will set a briefing schedule on the merits of the case this November. The second lawsuit was filed by Food and Water Watch and a coalition of food safety and consumer protection groups. It additionally alleges that the USDA failed to consider impacts to consumer and food safety when it eliminated the line speed limit. The suit also alleges that USDA lacks authority to delegate its congressionally mandated post-mortem inspection duties to slaughterhouse workers. The third, filed by the United Food and Commercial Workers Union of America, alleges that USDA failed to consider impacts to worker safety when it eliminated slaughterhouse line speeds. The union won that case before the trial court in Minnesota, which resulted in the vacatur of the line speeds portion of the rule. Industry is currently attempting to intervene in that case for the purposes of appealing the trial court's order. And that's because, remarkably, USDA has declined to appeal. So as of the date of this presentation, the USDA is not enforcing the new rule, which it has accepted has been vacated, and the line speed limit has reverted to the prior rule, which is 1,106 pigs. As a deregulated slaughter, USDA refused to regulate the treatment of non-ambulatory pigs, which is the subject of the clinic's second lawsuit, styled Farm Sanctuary versus Vilsack. Now, in 2002, Congress amended the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act to mandate that the USDA investigate and submit to Congress a report on the scope of non-ambulatory livestock, the causes that render livestock non-ambulatory, the humane treatment of non-ambulatory livestock, and the extent to which non-ambulatory livestock may present handling and disposition problems for stockyards, market agencies, and dealers. And that provision can be found at 7 U.S.C. 1907 sub A, which I have included as an excerpt here on this slide. Congress further mandated that based on the findings of that report, if the Secretary determines it necessary, the Secretary must promulgate regulations to provide for the humane treatment, handling, and disposition of non-ambulatory livestock. FSIS is responsible for implementing these mandates. For its part, the Federal Meat Inspection Act incorporates the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act by reference and also directs the USDA to examine and inspect all livestock before they enter a slaughterhouse, so that FSIS inspectors can separate any animals that show symptoms of disease to be slaughtered separately and potentially kept out of the food supply altogether. The National Pork Council estimates that more than 500,000 pigs arrive at the slaughterhouse unable to walk every year. According to an FSIS official, a review of Humane Methods of Slaughter Act non-compliance records found 18 times as many instances of inhumane handling involving non-ambulatory pigs as those involving calves. The official further noted that although more pigs are slaughtered than other species, downed pigs are also inhumanely handled at a disproportionately higher rate. According to Dr. Temple Grandin, a variety of reasons incentivize producers to send weakened or non-ambulatory pigs to the slaughterhouse, including that the mother sows are bred until near death to produce piglets, and that production practices prioritize rapid growth, high leanness, and extreme muscularity. In addition, growth-inducing drugs cause severe adverse health effects in pigs, which can lead them to be down pigs on the way to the slaughterhouse. There can be absolutely no doubt that failing to prohibit the slaughter of non-ambulatory pigs incentivizes producers to cruelly force pigs to rise so they can be slaughtered only for profit. On October 3rd, 2014, Farm Sanctuary, the Animal Legal Defense Fund, Animal Outlook, Animal Welfare Institute, Compassion in World Farming, Farm Forward, and Mercy for Animals jointly submitted a petition for rulemaking to the USDA requesting that FSIS prohibit the slaughter of non-ambulatory pigs pursuant to its congressional mandate. More than 5 years later, on September 16, 2019, FSIS denied that petition, stating that its existing regulations and inspection procedures were sufficient and effective in ensuring that non-ambulatory pigs are handled humanely at slaughter. Yet, in a response to a FOIA request for the report mandated by Congress, USDA has admitted it has no responsive documents, despite the passage now of nearly 2 decades since that mandate in 2002. The plaintiffs in this second lawsuit are the organizations that filed for that petition for rulemaking. They sued the agency on April 20th of 2020, alleging that Congress's failure to regulate for the non-ambulatory pigs violated the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act and the Administrative Procedures Act, and that FSIS arbitrarily and capriciously denied the petition for rulemaking and failed to investigate and regulate the slaughter of non-ambulatory pigs in contradiction of the congressional mandate. The organizations allege that the agency failed to consider the voluminous evidence included in the petition for rulemaking. In addition, plaintiffs allege that despite expressly rejecting prior industry assertions that self-regulation was adequate to protect non-ambulatory cattle, FSIS took a contrary position with regards to pigs and did not explain itself. That case is currently pending before the district court in the Western District of New York. The plaintiffs survived the government's motion to dismiss this last summer and are waiting for the case management conference this November. Thank you, and I'll take questions at the end of the panel.
Good morning and afternoon, everybody, depending on your time zone. My name is Hannah Connor, and I'm an attorney with the Center for Biological Diversity. For those of you who don't know the Center, we are a wildlife conservation organization that fights to secure a future for all species, great and small, including those hovering on the brink of extinction. You may ask, what is a wildlife conservation organization doing working on issues related to the food system, and specifically animal agriculture? Well, at this point in time, with nearly 10 billion terrestrial animals raised and slaughtered for human consumption each year in the United States alone, around 70 billion worldwide, that's excluding aquaculture, a rate that is expected to increase with population increases if we do not make a change, our food system plays a significant role in driving climate change and the currently unfolding mass extinction crisis. It is responsible for decreasing numbers of apex predators, wild herbivores such as bears, foxes, prairie dogs, coyotes, and wolves, and countless aquatic species, among others, including through direct harm, habitat degradation, and livestock production takes the prize as the single largest driver of global habitat loss. So the question of how to adapt our currently fragile food system from one that harms animals relies on the externalization of its costs onto communities and the environment, and is designed to benefit only a handful of multinational corporations, to one that is resilient, sustainable, and just, is a dynamic and multifaceted question that requires management across a variety of sectors. It also requires imagination, persistence, and the memory of an elephant. Consider closing your eyes as we remember together the sleepless, anxiety-soaked months of 2020 and 2021, and in particular of March through May of last year, as everyone around the world was unified in one overwhelming fact: that we were adjusting to a new normal, a new dramatically different fact where we don't know what the future was going to hold. Remember the physical and emotional discomfort that we felt being locked in our homes, often away from our families, and the creature comforts that we had known just days, weeks, or months prior. And people saying, how could this have happened? They could never have expected something like this to happen. Well, that's not true. We know that's not true. Perhaps the granular details we've lived from the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic to today are unique. For example, I never would have expected that on my birthday in 2020, the then president of the United States would have issued an executive order under a Korean-era law known as the Defense Production Act to force slaughterhouses to remain open and to identify them as, quote, critical infrastructure. But the concept of fragility in our food system and supply chains, corporate control and power imbalances, and the possibility of a worldwide pandemic tied to the exploitation of animals were not new. They were merely unheeded until the imperfect storm of COVID brought them back into stark focus. So, for example, going back to that fateful executive order, it was easy to guess before the emails came out in confirmation that the meat industry had drafted that executive order, and the president had merely placed his corrupt stamp of approval on its front and pushed it out the door. Or that the same industry used tactics such as full-page ads in the New York Times and the Washington Post to create fear of a meat shortage for their own bottom lines while experiencing record exports and profits as a result. Yet at the same time, still refusing to put into place appropriate policies, protections, and safeguards for the workers in those very same plants, and preventing them from death, sickness, and other trauma. So taking all of this into consideration during my time today, I will build off of the two prior presentations by discussing three of the most significant issues currently destabilizing our food system and future: zoonotic disease risk, supply chain bottlenecks, and climate change. Very sunny things. And all items that are laid bare by the current pandemic. And then we could do some work talking about solutions and alternative approaches at this critical juncture in time. So let's talk about the critical problem of zoonotic disease spread. According to an international panel convened by the G20, we are approaching a, quote, era of pandemics, where infectious diseases that stem from animals and spread into human populations are likely to become more frequent if we do not transform our relationship with animals and nature. We're not going to go too far in the weeds today on this. There is a panel tomorrow, pretty much almost at the exact same time as today, on zoonotic disease spillover and the One Health approach. But I do want to share a few points and ideas with you so that you walk away from this presentation with a clear understanding of how zoonotic disease spread is key and very centrally focused on factory farming and is inherent to that model of production. So first, according to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 3 out of every 4 new or emerging infectious diseases in humans come from animals. Indeed, many of the worst disease outbreaks of the last 40 years have been zoonotic in origin. And at this point, these diseases are constantly springing up and evolving. Wildlife and our increasing proximity to and exploitation of wildlife is generally considered to represent the most common source for these diseases, but industrially raised farmed animals can also be original sources or bridging hosts carrying the infection from the wild through to humans. Preventing the next pandemic, a new report by the United Nations Environmental Program estimates that 75% of the new infectious diseases that threaten humans come from animals. The report goes on to name the 7 major drivers of these emerging animal-to-human diseases. First is the increasing demand for animal protein. The more we eat, the more animals we need to raise for meat. Which brings us to the second driver of pandemics, according to this report, which is the intensification of animal agriculture. These operations are petri dishes for viral mutations, the animals who often lack physical distancing and whose immune systems are suppressed by stress and fear and manipulated as a result of these production systems, fall ill easily and exacerbate the shedding of zoonotic diseases, making factory farms the perfect breeding grounds for the development and spread of new and novel zoonotic diseases. I'd also be remiss if I didn't use this opportunity to note that, like factory farming of pigs and cows and chickens, the factory farming of fur-bearing animals like mink, which still occurs in this country as well, is also accompanied by significant zoonotic risk. Globally, an estimated 95% of fur comes from farms. Again, COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, the animal virus linked to COVID-19 in humans, provides a good illustration of that issue. But it's not an isolated problem. Since COVID-19 was confirmed in mink on fur farms in the Netherlands in April 2020, the disease has devastated farmed mink herds in various European countries, as well as in the United States and Canada. Since then, more than 12,000 farm minks across the United States have died from COVID-19 or culling efforts related to it, and millions more have been culled in Europe in an attempt to staunch the spread of the disease. Additionally, mink-to-human spread of SARS-CoV-2 has been reported in the Netherlands, mink-to-human specifically, and may have occurred in the United States. And then also important is that the American mink is a native species in this country. It's actually endemic across most of the United States. So there are dire potential threats to wild species if farmed minks that affect disease get into those wild species. And as we know, mink escape. They escape these facilities. And that is, quite frankly, great to get them out of there, but it is really concerning for the wild populations, including wild American mink, other mustelid populations, such as threatened and endangered species, as well as potentially other infected species that could thereafter contract the disease and carry it into wild populations, potentially creating reservoirs. And that just isn't a theoretical threat. It did happen in Utah when a wild mink was found with COVID-19, which it was believed to have gotten from a farmed mink that had escaped from a nearby facility. So the magnitude of these issues just can't be overstated. But we will now move into the other key supply chain vulnerabilities, including issues related to bottlenecks. So 4 massive companies today control 80% of America's beef, and just 3 companies control 63% of America's pork production. These vertically integrated corporations possess dominant market and political, as we saw earlier with that executive order, power as sellers of meat, buyers of livestock, and controllers of the production chain, which they use to manipulate the market by raising prices for consumers, lowering prices for farmers, and controlling every level of production, including the number and types of animals being raised by contract growers in ever larger and more concentrated factory farms. This dramatic consolidation of the meat and poultry processing sector also creates bottlenecks around production that manifest in the predictable supply chain pinches and vulnerabilities we saw play out dramatically for consumers, workers, and animals and the environment around COVID-19. Compare in 1967, nearly 10,000 slaughterhouses served local farmers across the U.S., while today just 95% of our country's cattle and hogs are slaughtered in about 60 supersized plants. That's a significant reduction. And as a result, while a handful of slaughterhouses shutting down a few decades ago may have caused localized ripples, nowadays it would cause an entire shutting down of the system for at least a certain period of time. We saw dramatic issues related to the mass killing of animals, the treatment of workers, the way that it played out on rural landscapes. But we also saw is that it opened the door for a handful of major meat packers to seize onto and message these issues to ultimately benefit their bottom line, a matter that the Biden administration is currently looking into and has said, quote, while factors like consumer demand and input costs are affecting the market, it is the lack of competition that enables meat processors to hike prices for meat while increasing their own profitability. Or just put another way, the twin trends of farm-level consolidation and corporate controller bottlenecks endanger the resilience of our agricultural supply chain, creating a food system that Tom Vilsack, our new old Department of Agriculture Secretary, calls rigid, concentrated, and fragile. And then finally, climate change. I am not going to bat you about the ears about climate change, but beyond threats to air and water, including exorbitant water uses by this industry, climate change is a significant threat and a significant vulnerability that it causes, both in terms of agricultural sustainability and the fragility of that system, as well as us as consumers, as well as us as people who share this planet. And there is really just no doubt that agriculture is, as a major land user and greenhouse gas producer, must be part of any solution related to climate change. For example, a 2020 study found that even if all fossil fuels emissions ceased today, the food system would still push warming more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And that's the dire level. That's what scientists have set as being the level at which we have a very little chance of return to our normal climate and our normal functioning. So in short, we simply cannot reach our climate goals without more aggressively and effectively addressing agriculture's role in climate change. And it's equivalent to approximately 1/3 of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, about the same of the transportation sector, when properly calculated to include all of the climate change impacts related to agriculture. So percentage-wise, what I mean by that is even though the US EPA estimates agriculture to be responsible for about 10% of US greenhouse gas emissions, which itself is likely an underestimate, this figure should, but does not, include other significant contributions from animal agriculture, including emissions from on-farm fuel and electricity use, emissions associated with the manufacture of agricultural inputs like fertilizer, emissions downstream of production, such as food processing, distribution, and food waste, and the impacts of continued agricultural land use, i.e. the continuing yearly impact of prior conversion of natural lands into agriculture. Even further, animal agriculture is the primary emitter of methane in this country. This is especially significant because methane emitted into the atmosphere is estimated to have about 28 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide over 100 years and more than 80 times the global warming potential over the next 20 years. Because of the significantly higher warming potential in comparison to carbon dioxide, cutting methane emissions, especially in the short term, is the best opportunity we have to immediately slow the rate of the climate crisis, even as we decarbonize our energy systems. What's concerning is that even though we saw many categories of pollution, including greenhouse gases, dip during COVID, as people worked from home and commerce outside of homes ground to a shut, the emissions of methane actually rose during COVID-19. NOAA's preliminary analysis showed that the annual increases in atmospheric methane for 2020 was 14.7 parts per billion, which is the largest annual increase recorded since systemic measurements began in 1983 and has been predominantly tied to biological sources, such as livestock production. So we have some work to do. With that in mind, let's talk through a few key solutions. A whole session could go into a discussion on solutions and alternative approaches, and to be honest, many solutions are not one size fits all. So I'm not going to attempt to cover the strategic kitchen sink. But before I close out my presentation, I did want to identify a few key approaches that I truly believe are possible and which will require systemic essential change across the food system, but will also give us a resilient food system. The first is just to go all in. Phase out the use of factory farms and stop pouring federal dollars into the construction and expansion of these operations. This one may sound overly ambitious, but across the country, efforts have been underway to put moratoria in place for the permitting and construction of factory farms and or to phase out certain operations by a date certain, including in Rhode Island, Iowa, and in Oregon. There's also enough power in this idea that there is federal legislation that's currently working through Congress called the Farm Systems Reform Act that was reintroduced earlier this summer that would place an immediate moratorium on the expansion and construction of factory farms and phase out the largest factory farms. It would also put in place buyer and buyout options for farmers who want to move out of the factory farming system of production. So, I mean, it's possible. I don't think it's not. And to the pandemic risks related to fur-bearing animals, the same is taking place at the state and federal levels. There is legislation that's introduced to phase out and limit the allowance for these operations to continue operating without some kind of more stringent regulations. One is the Minks Act, which is currently working through Congress. We also spent a significant amount of time in Oregon trying to pass legislation. And in the meantime, while we're working through how to get rid of factory farms, the federal government has got to stop pumping money, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, into the construction and expansion of factory farms through the USDA's Farm Service Agency, as well as staunch other flows of federal dollars into propping up these operations. And, internationally, there's a call for this as well. The IPBES, who you saw in the earlier slide related to zoonotics, has called for a tax on the highest risk pandemic activities and specifically identified livestock as being one of those activities. So there are a number of ways to achieve this goal. Next, even if factory farms become a thing of the past, there is just simply not the land mass on Earth to move all of those animals outdoors and onto pasture. So complementary to moving away from reliance on the factory farming method of production we must eat less meat. It is simple as that. And at the same time, the US government, complementary to the subsidy structure we just talked about, must move towards financing more plant-based alternatives and move away from financing industrial-raised animals and bailing out meat, dairy, and industrial-raised animal productions. Those are ways to help shift us in the right direction and shift us towards the systems that will be resilient as opposed to fragile and will be healthful and will feed our population. Direct monies should also go to tribal food sovereignty and food production, should support growth of BIPOC farmers and reintroduction of those programs for BIPOC farmers that have historically not had access to USDA programs. And the government also just plays a role in the overproduction of so many of our products like dairy and like cheese. And it needs to stop buying them out when there's a glut of products, spending hundreds of millions of dollars also to buy out cheese. If you stop buying it out, there will stop being gluts. We also as a group must continue to meet people where they are and help by providing support and guidance to people as they take the big step of transitioning away from a meat-based diet. And I just personally really want to thank the vegan cheese makers out there. You make life better and you are so appreciated. Please keep it up. And in particular, Catalyst Creamery from Tampa, I see you in that October issue of Veg News, and I support you. You are amazing. So thank you. Your cheese is divine. Moving into kind of solution 3, and we'll just do a few solutions really quickly because I believe I am out of time. But climate, you could go on for days about climate. It is at code red of being able to address these issues. So first, any climate solution must account for the true climate impacts of animal agriculture, including by preparing an accurate accounting of the greenhouse gas footprint of this industry from farm gate to fork. Second, significant measurable steps must be taken to reduce the footprint, including by regulating greenhouse gases from factory farms, efforts that have been underway for decades without any kind of acceptance from EPA of the need to do so. It is time. Third, USDA is at a critical juncture to address the climate impacts of animal agriculture, rather than just merely continuing to ignore it or greenwash alternatives such as carbon markets or other things that are not accountable or measurable. Fourth, see all the above solutions. Cut down your intake of meat. Get rid of factory farms. Those will do wonders for the climate. And as a bonus, implementing these practices will also increase resilience to extreme weather, reduce environmental and public health threats, and in most cases, improve agricultural productivity and profitability. And then 2 other quick ones. Enforce and support antitrust. That one speaks for itself. You've probably heard a lot about it. We obviously discussed it earlier on in terms of market consolidation. Those things can be done in a number of ways. Prohibit the use of unfair tournament or ranking systems for poultry contract growers. Protect livestock and poultry farmers from retaliation. Break up the big packers. And this is especially true as so many merger requests are coming through. The DOJ has a rule here to disapprove them. Create market transparency and protect farmers and ranchers from predatory purchasing practices. Hold meat packers accountable. Hold them accountable for their pollution to the environment. Hold them accountable for their harm to workers. Hold them accountable for their harm to communities. Hold them accountable for their harm to animals. Hold them accountable. And complementary to that is transparency, transparency, transparency. You hold them accountable not only by making sure that they are penalized for their harms, that those harms face repercussions, but also so that we see what is going on and so that they can't just get away with it in the cover of night. So those are really 2 complementary solutions, but also essential to round up the need to make our food system more resilient and address the fragility that it currently experiences. So in conclusion, the urgency of these combined crises, supply chain, climate, pandemic threat need to be met with effective answers and bold efforts to move away from factory farming and corporate control to a more just and equitable food system. That type of fundamental reform is possible. We just need to act now. I'm looking forward to discussing these matters more through the question and answer period. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to our panelists. Great presentations. Now we will begin the question and answer with our speakers. I'll start with a question for Iselin. It's related to the cigarette packaging imagery. Could you expand on how you think the images on packaging would work best, practically speaking? And then I think could bring in the rest of the group for the second part of this question, which is, why would any company be willing to put these images on their packaging?
Thank you for that question. I don't think they would be willing. I don't think the cigarette companies enjoy putting those graphic warning labels on their packages. So I think that there's going to need to be, it might feel like a far-fetched, proposal, but, the United States is the only, one of the only countries in the world that currently today does not have graphic warning labels on cigarette packages. And there's been decades of really intense advocacy to make that happen. And it actually looks like it's about to be happening by 2022, which is a really big deal because the United States would catch up to the rest of the world with that. So I think this is going to take a lot of citizen advocacy to put pressure on structures in power, lawmakers, legislatures, politicians, to say this kind of transparency and information sharing is necessary because that's the level of crisis that we're in. And how it would work practically, I would need to dig into that in more detail and explore it. But I did show that one example of this, I think his name is Joseph Poor, the scientist that has, proposed that we, provide scientifically accurate information that consumers could use. And my idea is to have it on a variety of metrics. So not just the climate effect of a particular food product, but, the effect on the animals' exploitation and welfare and the workers. So I think a lot of data would need to be collected, and then a lot of thought would need to be put into how to present that in a visually compelling way that is still, scientifically accurate and data accurate. But I welcome, Hannah, especially, you had a bunch of solutions that kind of dovetailed nicely with the ones that I discussed. So I don't know if any of my colleagues have anything else to add here.
No, I think that's right on. The question is not only how to implement it, but how to get the political power to see that it can be implemented. And that's sort of an across the board issue that we face. And so, the beginning part is to educate lawmakers, educate administrative officials to try to get them to take on these solutions, and then can get into kind of the gradations and details of what it can look like.
Great, thank you. Another question we just received, this would be for, I think, the litigators. Do you work or interact with small, sustainably focused local farmers who are practicing animal agriculture when trying to address these laws so as to ensure there is no unseen harsh effect on the local farms?
I can start with that because we do that a lot. And one of the goals of these efforts are a just transition away from factory farming's model of production, right? Recognizing that farmers are also often captive within this facility and within this means of operation. And so we work with farmers to make sure that there is an equitable future for everyone that allows us to continue moving forward with, a just solution, right? Like that's becoming a talking point at this point in time, but it is a reality of what we're working with. And truly the only way to inform it is to have those conversations with farmers on the ground about where they're seeing vulnerabilities, about where they think the USDA can help them, and about where they think we can move to make it better for everyone. And a lot of our moratoria campaigns, for example, are run hand in hand with small family farmers. Often they are put out of business by these huge multinational CAFOs. We work really closely with the Friends of Family Farmers, for example, in Oregon. There is a drastically reducing population of dairy operations, smaller family-run dairy operations, because they're just put out of business by these mega facilities. And so we do actually make a really good effort to have those communications and have those inform any of the policy recommendations that we make at either the state or federal level, because it's an important conversation to have. And it's just a vital part of the conversation.
Thank you, Hannah. This is a question for the entire panel. This week, we saw reporting that the Biden administration officials are announcing environmental justice as their top priority. Do you think this provides opportunities for taking on the animal agriculture industry?
I mean, I think that's important. Vital. Important is not even the right word. It is vital because environmental justice, food justice, justice in this space do not exist without each other. And there are so many ways, we didn't get a chance to talk about them, that pollution is disproportionately felt by low wealth and BIPOC communities. That is universally known in this country as being a problem. There have been a number of complaints brought under the Civil Rights Act specifically related to pollution from factory farms, disproportionately burdening these communities. And so, you can't just continue with the business as usual without recognizing that that disproportionate harm is falling on BIPOC communities. And our hope is that in adopting environmental justice, that we're actually going to see a change on the ground as opposed to lip service, because there has been, sort of decades of lip service around this issue that does a disservice to the people who are trying to desperately have a livable future, a livable life in the area that they don't want to leave, right? Many people historically are in their family homes, they're on their family properties, and they shouldn't be forced off of them because they can no longer leave their house because of the smells from CAFOs or because of the pollution from CAFOs. And so I would say we deeply support that prioritization. We think it's essential. And we also think it's essential that there are measurable changes that happen as a result of it, as opposed to it just becoming kind of an idea versus something that creates actual change on the ground.
Yeah, I would echo Hannah's thoughts and just add that from a litigation perspective, anytime the government announces a priority or puts into writing something that we're trying to use or prove as well in our litigation, it definitely helps legitimize the effort because, possibly, but for the most part in court, animal organizations are painted as radicals by our defendants. And so when the government is saying the same things, it really helps. So we hope to see efforts by the government as an affirmative matter, but we can also use those sorts of pronouncements, and we have in the past with regard to climate change to help us in our litigation.
Thank you, Jessica. That was a great segue to a next question, which is, I think probably an initial question for Iselin, but if others want to add on to it, sort of a practice-based question, considering there are a number of law students and early career attorneys here. Do you think the use of fear and anger and other emotions have a role in legal advocacy, particularly litigation, but could also include legislative advocacy, such as at pleadings or at oral argument or a hearing? Or are there risks that fear-based terms to describe the animal agriculture industry could backfire?
Thank you for that question. And I would love for my litigator colleagues to help me answer this question. Yes, I think there are risks, and I think that those risks need to both be thought through carefully and potentially be taken anyway. I think that all kind of bold litigation strategies involve risk. And so I think that a careful litigator would think through and, maybe, like moot different strategies. But I do think that pathos or, emotion-driven arguments, they're always going to lose if that's the only thing going for them, right? Like you can't win a legal case on emotion alone. But I think that you can use it as a powerful narrative thread when you do it carefully to support a really sophisticated legal argument. And so I just think that it takes a lot of really skillful lawyering, and that the emotion, the fear, the anger, the rage should not, overshadow or swallow the sophisticated legal and data-driven arguments. But I'm going to turn it to my litigator colleagues to see what their opinions are. They've been in the trenches navigating these strategy discussions.
As with everything, it's audience. right? I mean, I think that there is a role for emotions, just period, for any audience, but it depends on your audience. And as litigators, I see us as storytellers, right? First and foremost, that's what we are. Some of our story is like how a statute got to a regulation and how it's wrong. That's a story. But the thing that actually compels somebody is that they understand the problem because they understand the effect. And so, those things in large part mean that you do have to tell stories. We will tell stories of our members who are harmed because of these activities. For line speed, tell stories about our members who are concerned about what's going to happen in their communities because of these increased line speeds leading to increased number of transportation trucks coming through, increased having to see these transportation trucks coming through, increased waste flow from the slaughterhouses themselves because of increased slaughter. And if you just see it on the paper, there is not a lot of emotion to a list. If you hear it from somebody's voice, hear it from somebody's perspective and their lived experience, it changes things. So I do think that there is a role for emotion, and the type of emotion is very dependent on what your subject matter is, and how you think it's going to be effective. Often, as we know in this space, and as we know with things that include things like graphic images, it's always a balancing act for what's going to be effective versus what is going to turn somebody off and they will stop paying attention. And that's just a balancing act that we always kind of have to deal with. But I do think there's a role. Fear is a different one slightly for me versus just like emotive discussion of harm. Fear, I think, plays a little bit more in the climate context because I quite frankly am scared. As a person who deals with climate every day, I am scared. And so it is hard not to have that come into the conversation, and I think it should. But that might be different, in different contexts.
I always love it when Hannah goes first because she does such a nice job of encapsulating exactly the correct answer. I would only add that when the audience is a judge, they expect a level of dispassion that's really difficult to navigate when you feel really strongly about a subject, and especially when your clients do, because we don't work with clients who don't care. We work with clients who care a lot. So that it's a hard thing to navigate, and we do our best to put emotion into the context of the story we're telling at every turn, in my view, as a policy matter and as a rhetorical device, because these questions are big and complicated sometimes, and the effect of the answer and the outcome of the litigation can get lost if you don't continually remind your court that there's a real human outcome, a real outcome on animals, a real outcome on environment, whatever you're discussing. It can get lost in the statute didn't give the agency discretion to do this overly technical aspects of the law. So it's good to always bring it back to the real issues.
Well, this was a great answer, and it's been a great panel. And thank you again to the panel. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.